Welcome. I'm Janice Ellig, CEO of the Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search through our longstanding commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar series, which we started in March of this year during COVID-19 to bring thought leaders and subject matter experts together to help guide us through these very turbulent and difficult times. And today I'm truly excited to welcome an exceptional guest. He is not a C-suite executive, not a corporate leader, not a professor or inventor, but he is a first-time author and a young man wise beyond his years. His words are powerful, full of meaning, passion, and compassion. I recently read his released book, which just came out September 15th, and I've asked him to share his incredible story with us, as I believe he has so much to say and we have so much to listen to, because it's not just about him, but about his generation, his peers, our society, and where America is going from here. Welcome, Cole Brown, author of Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World. And in full disclosure, I knew Cole during some of his formative years when he was writing this book. And in full disclosure, I know his mother, Priscilla Brown, as she is a colleague and a dear friend, and I've known her professionally and personally. And he writes about her with great fondness, and we're going to be talking about that. And of course, you will be able to order the book, Greyboy. Now, we have much to talk about, so let's get started, Cole, because this is an incredible story that you have written about your experiences in between Black and white worlds. It is so touching, it's so compelling, it's shocking, it's sad, and yes, at times it's quite humorous, and it definitely warrants a second read, which I am going to do. And your creative writing and your story is wrenching because you really are truly in search of your identity. A Black boy in a white world, a Black boy becoming a Black man. And I believe you're not just speaking for yourself, but for others as well. And so I want you to talk about a little bit about the path that you're finding in this book and what you're expressing. And so what prompted you to write this? And tell us a little bit about the title that you chose as well.
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, it feels like we've known each other for some time now, and it's thrilling for me to finally have reached the stage where we can have one of these conversations. So thank you. I should say, in terms of what prompted me to write this book, there's sort of two answers to that question. What got me actually sort of in the process of writing is that I was a student at Georgetown. And this book began as an essay for a class. I was supposed to write an essay on a business that I wanted to start, and it was an incredibly long essay. And I basically told the professor that if I'm going to write that many words, I want it to be on whatever I want it to be on. And I knew that this topic, the topic of growing up Black in white spaces, was something that needed to be discussed. So that's what got me down the path of actually sort of sitting down in the practice of writing. But the real heart of that question, sort of why did I think that this story needed to be told, is that I knew it hadn't been for my generation yet. Like I grew up sort of surrounded by dissimilarity, not seeing myself reflected either in my immediate environment or in the media landscape more broadly. And I think that my path towards identity was made more difficult for that reason. So I wanted to write the book that I wish I had, which was basically letting kids that grow up like me know that they're not the only ones, they're not alone. And then you mentioned the title. The title is Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World. This book took me 4 years to write, and I think we cycled through nearly as many titles as there were days in the 4 years that I took to write it. I settled on Greyboy because I borrowed it from a Amiri Baraka poem. And I was sort of flipping through my mother's bookshelf at one point years ago. And there's a poem called Letter to Half-White College Students. And in it, Amiri Baraka is incredibly critical of the exact kids that I'm discussing about in this book. Kids that are in white spaces and in his estimation sort of are not black enough. And he calls them imitation gray boys. And I just loved that turn of phrase, imitation gray boys. So for a long time it was called imitation gray boys, and then I dropped the adjective and just made it gray boy.
So you talk a lot about your family background, which is I know a little bit about it from your mother, but talk to us about that, your Ethiopian roots. And once when your mother reprimanded you for referring to yourself as a prince.
Yes. So my Ethiopian roots actually sort of even further add to the mixed upness and the grayness that I felt growing up. So my mother's side of the family is Ethiopian, and my maternal grandmother lives in Ethiopia. My maternal grandfather lives in Ethiopia as well. So I spent time there quite a bit when I was younger. But it's pretty rare for one to be a second generation American Ethiopian. Ethiopian American, which is what I am. You've seen much more recent immigration. So as a result, I am much more Americanized than what we would, than Ethiopians would typically sort of associate with the identity. So that wrestling between Ethiopian and American was actually very similar to that wrestling between black and white in some ways, in terms of people attempting to understand where I fit. The Prince story is kind of funny. There's a chapter called "Not Really Black" in the book. I think it's one of the first chapters, and it's about that phrase "not really black" that I would hear often, both from white peers and black peers when I was younger. And in my case, when I was hearing it from black peers, particularly when I was at this school called Penn Charter for the first couple of years of high school, they would say to me, at one point I remember they said to me, I didn't refer to myself as it, but at one point they said to me, "Oh, you're an Ethiopian prince." And it was one of many just totally absurd justifications and reasons for attempting to understand who this black kid is that doesn't fit in what we understand to be the black mold. And that, again, that's sort of the crux of the book is attempting to expand that mold to include more of us. I am not, for the record, an Ethiopian prince. Let me just state that clearly.
Your mother set you straight on that. I know it.
Yes.
And she was is quite a disciplinarian in your life, and you say this throughout the book. But you lived in a very privileged world. You went to prep schools, so the William Penn, right? The Chestnut Hill, preppy white neighborhood. But you had a lot of discipline in your life as well. Your mother wouldn't let you call anybody by their first name who was an adult. And she was really trying to protect you, wasn't she, from what you might experience as a black kid, a black adult even growing up. And she wanted to make sure you didn't, fly too close to the sun, which you did many times dangerously, as you explained. And she probably found this out later on, right, in reading the book. But you had this privileged life, and you described one time you're at a party and there's a police come and you get out by the skin of your teeth, and you say about, if you'd ended up drunk and dead, your mother would have killed you, right? Yeah. There's a little bit of humor there. But had you not been privileged, you would not have had that happen. So there's a disciplinarian here that protects you, and you're in this white world and you're protected from it, and you know that, and yet you're still dangerously close to that sun. Describe a little bit about these juxtapositions of this life that you're living at that time.
Yeah, so I try to, there's a chapter called Parents Understand, which is about everything that we're talking about parenting in that environment. And the case I try to make is that there was essentially two sort of two large concerns, which led to sort of, as you mentioned, maybe perhaps a greater degree of discipline. The first was exactly what you mentioned in terms of the house party and the police. I mean, I was at this house party and the police come in, and my friend and I, who are the only black party goers, end up on the ground with guns. trained on us from the police. And those sorts of instances, the sorts of instances that we see in the news regularly these days, that rightfully terrified both my parents. That something like that could happen. So I think that just the understanding that that is possible requires you to train your child to be respectful and prepared in the face of authority. But then, less so the fear of bodily harm, more the fear of, in my environment of privilege, that somebody's mom, I don't know sort of how connected she is, and I end up offending her, and that's what keeps me out of Georgetown someday. That was also a fear that I would not have, the benefit of the doubt that so many of my peers would have. And that's what leads to, I talk about in the chapter, things that were taken really seriously in my household that likely were not taken nearly as seriously in many of my white peers' households. Not walking through a doorway before a woman does. Referring to adults as Mr. and Mrs. Things that are important. I mean, but I don't know that they were trained as mortally important as they were oftentimes in my household. Those are in some ways lessons that didn't trickle down to my generation in many ways. But I think that in my household that it was incredibly important to show that deference, to show that respect, for fear of what might occur should you not.
You would never talk to your parents the way you heard some of your peers talk to their parents. You make that
Absolutely.
very clear.
Absolutely. And again, I struggled to write this chapter because I feared that in this chapter in particular, I didn't want to be like painting my white peers in broad strokes. I understand that there are varying degrees there. But there were often encounters where I heard, I'm at a play date and I hear a white friend say something to their parent that I just could not imagine happening in my household.
Yeah.
Because that showing respect in terms of language in particular could not have been more significant, could not have been sort of trained and more important in my household.
Let's go to a college roommate and his white family invite you to a trip to the Bahamas, and your experience there, where you see the poverty in the Bahamas of the Black people, and yet you are treated royally with your white friends. How does that make you feel?
So that's the first chapter in the book. It's called My Kind of People. And it was a really stark experience because I went with, as you mentioned, my college roommate, whose name is Andrew. And Andrew, I went with Andrew and his white family to this island in the Bahamas where it was a small island. And every tourist on the island was white and from out of town, obviously a tourist, oftentimes from Manhattan. Every service person on the island was Black and local. So that meant I was the only person crossing literally on the entire island. It was a small island, so I know this. Was the only person crossing that racial class divide. And I really struggled with what that meant about me and my position in that place. Because in many ways, the islanders, the locals, felt like they should be my people. Back home in the States, we have the nod where you walk past a Black person and almost irrespective of class, you have that nod. It's a sign of solidarity. And the fact that I wasn't getting those small things, language, the way we shake hands, little things that let you know that we're there. It was clear that they did not see me as one of them. And I struggled with what that meant about who I was. And then on the other side, the tourists, my roommate and so many of the friends that we had there, it was clear that they did see me as one of them.
Right.
And that too caused me to struggle. And I struggled with, there was one girl, there's a moment in the chapter where we go to a girl's house, and I think it was her great grandmother had purchased the house on this island. And colonialism is not that far back in the history of that country. And in our house, there was paintings of colonial people. And I remember thinking, like, what does it mean about me that I'm getting this tour and told this history, although I know very well that in my own history I would have been on the other side. So I wrestled with that, and actually the chapter "My Kind of People" was written pretty much entirely while I was on that island, and I'm not sure I come to many conclusions because it's the beginning of the book, but eventually I did kind of find my way out of it.
You'll have to go back. Your
Yes.
private school experiences, and you went to two different ones.
Mhm.
Describe the black table. And you have a friend, is it
Yeah.
Taryn, a woman, she decides
Yeah.
to stay with her preppy white friends, not stay with her black friends. What are the choices there, and how do you make those choices?
So the black table is both the literal table in the lunchroom where black kids sit. It is also all of us that sat around it. So we were referred to as the black table. Uh, and I described my moving to the black table from the the white lunch table that I'd been sitting at throughout my time at Penn Charter. I described my moving to the black table in 10th grade. And although as an adult looking back on that, that sounds like a trivial thing, it was like momentous in my life. It was a monumental shift in my life. Uh, because at that point I was so deprived of sort of an understanding of who I was and who we as a people are and what we could be, particularly in that space. And moving to the black table was the first time that I felt like I had some sort of control in an environment that was not created for me or with me in mind. So the black table is again sort of just a table off in the corner where all the black kids sit, and I think that this is not a rare institution. I think you would see this in most private schools, and it's a way for us to feel some solidarity, uh, togetherness in a place where so often we don't feel we're reflected. Taryn, that you mentioned in the book, made a different decision. Taryn chose to sit at a white lunch table, and I think that the population I'm discussing here, token black kids,
Yeah.
are unique in that we are able to make that choice. That there's not sort of a given place where we might fit, and uh, either one comes with consequences. I found an entirely positive experience there. Taryn felt that she would have fit in both, but at times felt cast off from the black table for reasons of being called bougie and uh, not fitting in there. So she made a different choice. I think both come with their own consequences, and people kind of got to figure it out as they may.
Taryn also tried to bring the two together. She tried to bring
Yes.
the white girls over to the black table, and they felt like they were ostracized from the black table.
Yeah.
Now, that
Yeah.
could have been their own perception too, and not being
Yeah.
accepted by the black table, right?
So
You don't know.
I right, and I try to say that is that
Yes.
Taryn insists that they were welcome, and I can speak to my own experience. Like there was no like blacks only sign over the table. Like we like
Right.
we would have been more. We would have been more than welcoming. I like to think should any of our white peers that we were friends with wanted to come sit at the table. Um, but there was sort of an invisible borderline where they didn't feel as though they could cross it, and I think that speaks to, I mean, an understanding even at what is then sort of early high school or even middle school at times, an understanding of the differences in culture, and where one ultimately belongs, and negotiating that those differences is what both Taryn and I wrestled with.
But it speaks to what we're going to get to a little bit later, how you do bring people together,
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
where we go from here. So let's talk a little bit about the dating that you did, because I thought that was
Yes.
really interesting. You had
Yes.
some some very graphic stories which were really interesting about.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to mention their names or not, but you had three great
We
loves.
they're not their real names, so we
Okay.
can't.
All right, I didn't think so. But you had a white girl, an Italian girl, and a
Jamaican.
Jamaican girl, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
you describe them all vividly as great loves of your life. And,
Hmm.
you know, but, and the last one, I think you fought with greatly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You just couldn't
Yeah.
get a meeting of the minds.
Yes.
But you come to some conclusions, I think, about, but they weren't like Ma, you know, I mean, it was
Yeah.
like really being with a Black woman was, you know, maybe more to what you really wanted at the end of the day. Can you describe a little bit about the experiences that you've gone through and where you are today?
So that all comes from a chapter called The Great Ones. And the Great Ones I wrestled with, I think probably more than any other chapter that not probably, definitely more than any other chapter that I wrote. I mean, I started The Great Ones when I began writing this 4 years ago, and I think I was still writing it right up until the deadline, 3.5 years later. So I really wrestled with it. The reason that I wrestled with it is because I wanted to speak to what I knew were two of my own truths. One was that, as you mentioned, two of the three girls that I've dated were white, and I knew that I loved them dearly, and I'm still close with both of them. On the other hand, there is a truth that sort of I love and respect Black women, and yes, my mother and my sister and my grandmother, but also like Black women writ large, and so much of the sort of power and grace that I see embodied in them. And those two truths are oftentimes viewed as being necessarily in conflict with one another. So I was wrestling with how to depict that without sort of offending, or with getting my honest emotions on both sides correct. So in terms of the conclusions that I come to, I think that the conclusion that you're alluding to in terms of not being like Ma, that was really the conclusion that my best friend came to, Jackson, who's also in the
Jackson,
chapter.
right. Mhm.
Jackson dated a white girl for about 3 years or 4 years, and his mother really struggled with that choice that he was making, and he ultimately succumbed to an urge to be dating someone within his own race.
Right.
He now is dating someone in his own race. Her name's Sydney, and Jackson and Sydney are, they're dating, so of course they're very close. But there's an understanding that he feels he has with Sydney that he would not have had with a white girlfriend. Where the chapter finds me at the very end is the third of the three great ones, and her name is Anna, and in the book her name is Anna, and Anna, as you mentioned, is Italian, and I ultimately choose not to date Anna because essentially because she's white, and struggle with that decision for the next like 2 years of my life.
Yeah.
And there's actually a large portion of that chapter that was written pretty much the night that I felt Anna broke my heart. And oh man, that initial version of that chapter was rough. It was much longer. But I
Moved on, I think, right?
yes, I did. One has to. But I think that what I really, in my own case, I'm not sure there's as many conclusions as there is just trying to wrestle with these choices that we make and why. That's sort of what that chapter attempts to chart.
Interesting. Yeah, it was Jackson. That's right. He's the one.
Yes.
Yeah, all that long.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the chapter, the reveal?
Mm-hmm.
That was a defining moment. That was a turning point. That was on the soccer field, right?
Yep.
You'd known ignorance about the Black, you felt that about being Black, but you'd never really felt or seen bigotry.
Yep.
And you were enraged by this.
Yep.
Describe what this was.
Happy to. So the reveal, that term I take from W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, and he's quoted in epigraph before the chapter. And he talks about this revelation when it's a seemingly mundane moment where he's attempting to give a white girl in his class. W.B. Du Bois was raised in Massachusetts in a mixed race school, and he's attempting to give a white girl in his class a Valentine, and she rejects it. And he talks about the revelation of of him finally understanding his position in the world. So I use the term the reveal to describe exactly that sort of we have an understanding, a knowledge really of, the history that we've been handed down. We have a knowledge of sort of the microaggressions and ignorance that we see in our own life. But when you really confront bigotry for the first time, it reveals something about sort of yourself and where you are in the world that you didn't know existed. So my version of the reveal, I say, was I was on a soccer field, like you mentioned, in Delaware, and for really no reason at all. I mean, I had called out to the ref, but really for no reason at all. A player turns to me, says, "What the F are you doing here, N-word," and spits on me. Says, "You don't belong here," and then spits on me. And the brazenness of it, like it wasn't just being called the N-word. Frankly, I had been through that. I was a black soccer player. I'm often the only black kid on the field. But the brazenness of that, the fact that he would look me in the eye and with such pride, relegate me to really like our lowest human qualities. That is what was for me just like totally world shifting. I had never really sort of run into that. And I fell into a frenzy over it. I mean, I like nearly blacked out and just went crazy. But I also try to, in the chapter, The Reveal, depict other people, other friends who have had their own reveals, at times in mundane ways like W.B. Du Bois. At times it's just sort of the way someone looks at you and you realize, oh, wow, all of this history that I've learned about, falls very hard on the body. I mean, like exists here in the here and now as well. So that's the crux of that chapter.
But that was such a defining moment for you in terms of what you went forward with. It was like the whole plot, right? I mean, you would go forward with so much more knowledge because of that. And it involved another friend too, who pulled you off of this. Boy, you were going to hit him with such rage, and you were pulled off.
It did. So it changed one. Actually, at the time, I was a senior in high school, about to apply to college. I think I was 2 days away from applying to college. Had written all of my stuff and went home and deleted my college essay and rewrote it on that day. About that incident. I'm not sure. Well, it all worked out in the end. I'm not sure my mom would have loved that, but
would be like that, yeah.
Right. But it was because it was just so formational in my life around. It's like you learn that you've been playing a game. You thought you were playing checkers and you're playing chess. It's like there's different rules to this game than I realized all along. And then, as you mentioned, I literally had to be physically pulled off of this guy because I was just in such a blinding rage that was really more than rage, confusion around where it was I fit in this plot.
And also, you reflected on how you would have handled it.
Yes, yeah, and I think about that. There's a I wish I could remember it. I'm not going to. There's a term for this in Italian that I'm not going to be able to remember. But it's when you're reflecting on a moment and thinking, man, this is how I should have done it, and that really eats you up. I think we all do that at times. And I was the only black. The friend who pulled me off is named Evan, and he's half black. And Evan and I were the only black people really in that entire environment. Everybody else on both teams was white. All the parents were white, with the exception of my mom and his dad. And I remember for days thinking to myself that I would have turned to this huge crowd of only white people as they were heckling me as though I was in the wrong. Because that's another important point is that as this is happening, they're yelling down and cursing at me, really, a child. And I reflect on the fact that I would have turned to them and said that they've poisoned their children, that bigotry is hereditary, and that you've handed these traits down to your children, and that's what got us here. I didn't do that. Instead, I flipped them all off and stormed off to the bench. But had I had that moment again, I would have behaved differently.
But it was a learning. You learned from it.
Yes.
And you thought about it afterward. We all go through that.
Yeah.
Ferguson, Missouri, 2014. It's been over 6 years, but you remembered it then. And that grand jury declined to indict Darren Wilson, the white officer, for shooting Michael Brown, a black 18-year-old. Describe your reaction to the news then. And a friend texted you and said, I can only imagine how you're feeling and what you were going to do.
Yep. So when that happened, I was at the time a bouncer. I was a freshman at Georgetown, and I was a bouncer at a bar on campus.
I can't imagine you as a bouncer. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I am not. I don't know if Zoom is totally capturing the fact that there's not a lot of mass here.
Yeah.
I'm not. But I wasn't. I was at this like remarkably uncool bar on campus, and it was my first kind of real job. And from that bar, I could see CNN showing the verdict coming in as it was happening, that the grand jury would not indict Darren Wilson. And I think most people will remember sort of Ferguson, particularly in those early nights, got really hot really quick. I mean, it was just, the protests happened almost instantaneously. And as I'm bouncing, I receive a text from my friend saying, we could get in the car tonight. I'm in DC. He said, we can get in the car as soon as you get off shift and drive to Missouri. We can drive to Ferguson. And I had a feeling, I mean, on the one hand, my shift ends at midnight. Like, I don't want to drive through the night to Ferguson, Missouri. But on the other hand, like, I had a feeling like I belong there. Like, this is, I'm 19 years old at this point, and this is what I'm supposed to be giving to America and the world is my energy around these issues. So we were going to go, and then I was packed to go. And then I think gunshots were fired somewhere in Ferguson, and there was a lot of confusion and sort of we ended up backing out for that reason. But instead we go to the White House and protest there. And it was such a strange mix of emotions, because on the one hand, there was grief and anger and despair, and it was cathartic for that reason. I mean, just people weeping in the streets about the injustice here. On the other hand, like Howard University, a historically black college and university, all of their student body, it seemed, were in the streets. And whenever that many of us get together, there has to be some joy as well, just in seeing each other, just in being in that community. And there was a constant wrestling match of trying not to seem joyful in the face of despair, but also trying not to seem hopeless in the face of what is clearly a hopeful generation. So I write about that sort of wrestling match, but also that in many ways was a reveal as well. Each of these incidents is in many ways, I think just today, I only saw the headline when I woke up. It's early here in Sydney. But just saw that no one will be charged for Breonna Taylor's death. That, if not for me, for many people, will be a reveal about consequences and who faces them in our country.
So the Black Lives Matter movement, inequities, what are your feelings about that, and what's happened to you and what's happened to others? And you put a lot of their names in your book.
Yeah.
What's to be done? What should we be doing? I'm white. What should I be doing? What should we all be focused on today?
That is such a big question. I do list many of their names in the book. That list is now outdated and has been for some time. What should we be doing? In terms of the last question, sort of allies, what I think that it requires is sort of wrestling with the narratives that we feed ourselves. I think that we're in a state so often now where each we have almost siloed universes, like siloed environments where I in this corner of Philly as a white person can have a totally different understanding of the world than my black counterpart in this corner of Philly. And I think it requires wrestling with the narratives that we feed ourselves about these other people who we inhabit space with. I know that that seems sort of esoteric and gray, but I think it requires doing the work of reading and understanding this history, and understanding this history not only through the eyes of those that have so commonly written it. I mean, understanding this history through the lens of the oppressed people. I think that level of understanding is required. In terms of my feelings on this moment in Black Lives Matter, I'm in Sydney, Australia. I'm not sure if that's been mentioned. I live here in Sydney, and watching my country from this distance has been, I think I will reflect on this someday and think of it as sort of one of the most difficult times of my life. I'm deeply concerned about these issues and the ongoing divisiveness. And frankly, am not wildly hopeful in this moment. I think that things will continue to get perhaps, crazy and more frayed before they get better, unfortunately. And perhaps the recent Breonna Taylor result is confirmation of that. So I'm deeply concerned in terms of how I feel in this moment.
Do you think public-private partnerships, do you think the CEOs reaching out saying that they are looking to work with local officials, cities? I mean,
Yeah.
to me, the federal government can do so much, but there's so much to be done at the
Yeah.
local level. So the Ken Frazier's, the Brian Moynihan's,
Yeah.
Many of these great leaders, are stepping up. And I think, that working with the YMCA's, the local charities, and public-private partnerships, a lot gets done at the local level and by local leaders. I think local governments.
Yeah, and I am cautiously optimistic about much of that's been announced. I mean, particularly in the immediate wake of George Floyd's death. You turn on your notifications, and every other second there's some new company doing something new for these causes. And like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic. The reason that I'm cautious is that I do fear at times that was done to such an extent that it almost seems faddish. Like these are serious issues that again fall very hard on the body. These are issues that will not dissipate in 6 months when something else is cool. So I do have concerns about the true level of commitment there, just because the response was so immediate. That said, there are absolutely leaders. I just saw that John Utendahl, helped raise like $2 billion in bonds or something for these causes. The fact that there is true leadership that's attempting to affect real change, I do think that there's a place for that. I think that absolutely this is not a government issue so much as it is what us, both in the private sector, but then also at the individual level, are doing to attempt to, support these issues.
So getting back to your book, because the issues we're talking about are pretty big. I think all of us individually have to reach out and across the aisle, both in the government basis, but the social issues, to each other, and really walk in each other's shoes as much as possible. Because we all have different upbringings, and so you search for your identity, I search for my identity. We're all very different from where we came from. As you've searched for your identity, and I loved your ending to your book, in terms of you're searching for your individuality. You're not an angry person, Cole.
No.
I know you've had some things that have happened to you that you're not happy about. There have been inequities or whatever. You're in a consulting firm now. You're doing well. You're not angry, but what are you feeling as you continue to search for your identity?
Someone else I was just on a podcast and someone raised that question. They said, why are you not angry? You don't seem angry. I think that I don't think there's always very much utility in anger. even if that anger is justified. I've seen my grandfather, who's in the book as well, Pop. Pop, to his dying breath, was angry. And I love Pop dearly. And I understand why Pop was angry. I mean, Pop had reason to be angry. That said, I'm not sure anybody suffered more greatly from Pop's anger than Pop. So I'm not, in part because I don't see much utility. That said, there are moments. I mean, that, the reveal that we discussed, that was a moment of true anger.
Right.
George Floyd's video, that was a moment of true anger. But generally speaking, as my resting state, I just don't think that it would be in my own best interest, let alone anyone else's. Where you find Cole Brown now, and in the closing chapter, I try to say this, is that I'm comfortable with myself, and so much of this book is about being uncomfortable, about not seeing myself reflected, and going through that journey, you arrive at an end point of understanding, who I am and what I'm about, understanding that I stand for these values, understanding that these many influences determined who I am, and I can embrace all of them collectively in one body. So that was a long time to get there. But as I said, I live in Sydney, and I don't know that I would have had the courage or confidence to move to Sydney in the many, many white rooms that I'm in these days, had I not gone through that journey. I think it was well worth it.
Well, you also had a lot of love around you. I mean,
absolutely.
Your tribute to your mother is phenomenal. I love your mother too, but do you want to say a few words about that? Because you had great family, and your sister Faith, who's very different from you. There's no question about that, and I think that you leave the book knowing that, understanding that that there's three women in my life. My grandmother, who was a maverick and remarkable in her own way, still is. My mother and my sister, who is a maverick in her own way and will be well into the future. The three of them shaped who I am today, and I couldn't write a book without sort of appropriately depicting them that way. Understanding that they are the reason I am the way I am, and I love them dearly for that. So I certainly tried to tribute to all three of them, but my mother in particular, she has a chapter in the book, as you would have read. You probably would have learned one or two things about my mother in that chapter, and she's absolutely remarkable, and I'm appreciative for her. Yes, she writes this letter to you, which is so moving. It's I think she is a remarkable executive and a remarkable person. She really is, and. I want to ask a question before we end, but there is a question that comes in from our audience is, where's your dad, Payne Brown?
Yes. He is present in the book. I actually write about him quite a bit. Yes. My father and I have a bit of a complicated history, but my dad influenced me incredibly strongly as well. I mean, I think that I talk about in The Great Ones, the vision of manhood that I understood and respected when young, and much of that coming from mafia movies, just because of like the quiet confidence, the stoicism, and my father is in many ways that. He's in many ways sort of stoic, and it doesn't have to say much for him to enter the room and he's there. So I think that, and he's also a thoughtful person. So I think that much of that sort of internal monologue and stoicism that at times I think I might be guilty of, I got from him as well. But those high school years that I write about in the book, that was really time spent with my mother and my sister, and at times my grandmother, which is why I try to give them their shine as well.
Yeah. And your grandmother, I think you mentioned, was the first senator in Ethiopia, right?
Yeah, she was the first female senator of Ethiopia. She was also sort of the acting first lady of the country under His Majesty Haile Selassie. Yeah. She is remarkable, has her own book, and probably could have a couple more as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it begs the question, are you going to write another book?
You know, it's crazy that you put a book out, and within like I was getting that question like 3 months before the first book came out. I'm still reeling and recovering from the book just released last Tuesday. So I'm still reeling and recovering from what was an intense process. Right now, we're in the process and having discussions about what an adaptation, a non-screen adaptation might look like of the book. So that's my focus right now, trying to see if I am any good at writing screenplays. It's worth mentioning, like, I have a day job. I work for Boston Consulting Group, so I'm doing that too. But then once you know, we get to whatever the natural endpoint is for this on-screen adaptation, there will absolutely be another book, and ideas are starting to kind of percolate on that.
Well, I'm going to read it again because I cried part of the way through. I laughed part of the way through. It's really such a moving book. It's really phenomenal. So you did a great job.
Thank you.
You say you fashioned a little bit after Baldwin, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah. He and
Baldwin.
Ta-Nehisi Coates are like my strongest influences. I think I read all of their stuff.
You know, and I quote him a lot. And there's one quote: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." I use that all the time because so many things do need to be changed. But you know, it is a remarkable book. So we can order this online. It's available.
You can get it everywhere books are sold. Certainly on Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, online or in person.
So Greyboy, well, it's a great book. Thank you, Cole Brown, for writing it and really sharing so much of your experiences. It's really a sensational book and great writing, very creative writing, and it's a wonderful book. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you for this discussion. This was fantastic. This was super enjoyable. So thank you for having me. I really appreciated it.
So good luck in Australia. We look to see you soon. And again, we'll be buying your book. And thank you to our audience, to everybody. Stay well, stay safe. And Cole Brown, we're looking for that screenplay and the next book. Stay well.
Yes, sounds good. See you.